we've had some questions already, and I think it's time maybe to put some of those questions to our esteemed panel.
Yes, certainly, Dr. David, no problem. So this one is aimed for Jim, but obviously this is a discussion, so anybody can jump in. Earlier you stated in your presentation that CMOs account for a high percentage of FDF manufacturers. So this question came in online from Dan Stanton, who's the editor at BioPharm Report. And he said, as one of the fastest growing areas in pharma, how have CMOs adjusted their service offerings to ensure a larger slice of the FDF market share?
Wow. Well, good question, and thanks to Dan for asking that. I think you're seeing a number of developments there. One has been just to kind of broaden their capabilities. The largest CMOs typically have more capabilities in terms of more dosage forms, and will typically have facilities on multiple continents. So they can both operate on a more global basis, and they can service more of the pipeline than perhaps they could in the past. And I would say also another trend you're seeing is more CMOs that are trying to offer both the finished dosage form and the active ingredient, the API. As you saw from the one slide, many of the companies on that list had capabilities for both finished dosage form and CMO and API. So they position themselves to be something of a full service or one-stop provider, where a company with a molecule can take that to one supplier, have the API process scaled up and manufactured, and then the API converted to the dosage form, all within one manufacturing organization. That's been an important, well, it's a relatively recent development in the industry. We'll see how important it actually becomes. But I think it also has a lot to do with just reliability and quality and depth of capability. That the CMO industry is a lot more sophisticated today than it was 10 or 15 years ago.
Okay, thank you. He had a further question from your insightful presentation he'd like to hear your viewpoint on, and it was, how is the demand for increasingly complex FDFs affecting the ongoing consolidation trend among CMOs?
It's having a big effect, really, because a lot of the M&A activity in the industry is driven by companies trying to acquire new technologies that can extend their capabilities and address these issues. So to give a few examples, a couple years ago, Catalent, which is one of the 2 or 3 biggest FDF CMOs, acquired Micron Technologies, which is specialized in micronization, grinding the API down to very fine particles. And because they wanted to add that capability to their full offering. Capsule Gel bought Bend Research. Bend Research is a leader in spray drying technology. Patheon bought Agear, which is a smaller spray drying company founded by someone who used to work at Bend Research. And there was news just the other day that Aptuit bought a small company here in the UK called QCept, which also does spray drying. So you're seeing, certainly reaching for the technology has been a big driver of the M&A activity. And then you have a situation, like I mentioned, with Consort Medical, which has tried to combine its device capabilities with the contract manufacturing capability, so they can offer kind of a full service device and filling the device offering to the market. So the ability to add those technical capabilities has been a big driver of the industry consolidation.
Okay, thank you. A very thorough answer. I'm sure that Dan will be very pleased. I have a few more, but I will intercept.
Well, let's just find out. Does anyone around the table have any questions? I mean, I think there's been quite a lot of information there. Or are you going? Have we stunned you into a shock silence? Have you? Yes, great. So let me just come over to you, Susan. What's your question?
I'd like to ask Alan what he thinks about the Indian generic market, what trends are occurring, and what market implications will these have?
Great question.
Well, I think it's a very good question, Susan, because for the last 5 years, as I've been talking to some of my Indian clients, the Indian market itself is growing and continues to grow rapidly based on affordability, increasing affluence, and also access to healthcare. And the Indian government has moved a long way with regard to insurance coverage for much of the population. Okay, getting to get access to that healthcare is not easy in certain places, but I've advised many of my Indian clients, if you're looking to expansion, look within India, because as that market is growing rapidly, the opportunities are there for a lot, as I say, for a lot of the older molecules that are off patent, rather than the risk of going into the developed markets, Europe and the USA. I used to work for Dr. Reddy's, who obviously had a strategy of international expansion and have been very successful at it. But there are other local Indian companies who have focused internally and for the emerging markets and have also done extremely well. Okay, margins may be lower, but volumes can be much higher, risk is less. So the Indian market is very attractive, and particularly if you're an Indian player. And I think we've learned that the acquisition of Indian companies by European or American companies is now sort of almost frowned upon by the Indian government. So inward investment by Indian companies probably offers more opportunities now versus the competition from big international players.
And perhaps I could ask there, what about quality control from India? Because I think that's an issue if you're a purchaser. Have you a comment on that?
That's a very good question, but also a very political one in many respects, because once again, it's the bad news that gets the media attention. And we have issues in the USA with plants, we have issue in Europe with plants. I think the biggest concern is when that it's almost like a criminal offence that someone has deliberately changed data, and the evidence for that in India is no different to really the rest of the markets. I think the confidence in the major Indian companies is there, and let's face it, the USA, they import a lot of Indian products, have a lot of Indian players in the market in India. I'll be a little bit controversial and say that the same cannot be said necessarily as of today with the majority of Chinese manufactured products, and part of that is a cultural and language issue in terms of understanding what is fully required.
Is there an element of secrecy though? Because obviously India has I would say, and it is a political point, has a more sort of open dialogue possibly than other countries.
Yeah, but I think also the regulators know the Indian market. They know the Indian companies and they inspect them quite regularly. So I think you're absolutely right to raise that issue, but I think really people assume that the quality is less good, bad English, but the quality controls are lower in India than they are in other markets. Now, part of the reason for that is that India has used patent infringing materials, which means that the products are not available and usable in the Western markets. So sometimes there is the assumption that that product is inferior, but it's not necessarily that. The Indian government now, and I think companies like Dr. Reddy have said, the products they develop will be for global markets and not just for the Indian market. So they have accepted that there is a perception that the products in India are less quality assured than the products outside of India, and that's not really true.
So are you saying they get products to market quicker in India because of the way they're doing it?
yes, generally speaking, the markets will come to... There's two things which drive the market access in India. One is affordability, and so we have the compulsory licensing issues that we've seen in India with regard to access to some of the newer medicines which have been unaffordable in India, so compulsory licensing invoked for certain products. But at the same time, there's a big demand for the older products as well. And the regulatory approval in India is sometimes difficult, but you're dealing with one country, whereas if you're trying to get regulatory approval in Europe, you're dealing with 27 odd countries, and it can be a minefield. So I say to my Indian clients, do what you're good at, which is supplying the Indian market. There's a huge opportunity there.
Perhaps I could just ask a very political point, given that, I think most people around the world are aware that we're about to have a monumental vote next month on Brexit and whether we leave the EU. Will that have an effect? I don't know whether any of you can answer that. Will that have an effect, given that at the moment there's a European licensing agency? Do you believe that the vote is important in terms of what happens to the UK market?
Yes, Paul, you've got the ears of most of the people involved.
Riley, can we just grab a mic? Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thanks very much. So it's probably very apposite that we're sitting close to the Thames in London, because the European Medicines Agency is just a little way down the river from here.
I thought you were worried you'd be thrown in for your answer. No.
We're very high up here, so I think it would be a big splash. So, yes, it's an interesting topic, and a lot of people are talking about it at the moment. What could the consequences be one way or the other? But one of the strengths of the European regulatory and licensing system is that it is quite open in terms of its access. So countries who are currently geographically in Europe do participate in those systems. So like Norway, as you talked about as an example in lots of contexts around potential Brexit, but Norway is a full participant in the European regulatory system. So taking that as a fairly decent example, I wouldn't expect any radical changes, whatever the vote is here.
Now, that's really important. Now, obviously you can tell that this is so politically sensitive. Shouldn't the pharmaceutical industry have a say on that as well, just in terms of information? Because actually, we're living longer. Pharmaceuticals are very important in terms of preventative health that we heard about from Alan earlier. Surely that the pharmaceutical industry should make those points to the general public.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's the pharmaceuticals industry's place to get too involved in that debate, but I'll answer your question from a slightly different angle, which is to think a bit about how the pharmaceutical industry operates itself. And we've heard that very clearly throughout this morning, that it's very much a global business. Yeah. And has to deal with lots of different environments, both political, regulatory, technical and scientific, and manages that really, really well. So I'm sure whatever local issues we have here in the UK about whether to stay as part of the European Union or not, the pharmaceutical industry will manage them really well, as it has to do with all the complexity that's part of its current business.
Perfect. You should be a politician, actually. That was very good. Very good answer indeed. Do we have any other questions from...
One for Alan.
Yes, let's hear your
Alan
question.
And Jim, if you want to chime in. No, just from a generics industry perspective, I was very encouraged to see that the days of the blockbuster are back. That was nice to hear. I just wondered, in one of the charts you showed Sovaldi and Harvoni, do you think that's an anomaly in being a blockbuster, small molecule, oral solid dose drug? Or could we see others, perhaps oral insulin tablets or multiple sclerosis?
That's another good question. I have to probably say to that yes, because you have a finite population of patients who really want medication and treatment now, and you have a 98% cure. That's almost like, shall we say, the heavens opening for Gilead to say, the market needs, patient needs, and here I have the perfect mousetrap. And no one's needing to beat the way to the door. Although, of course, they face the issue of pricing. A lot of negatives on pricing, but you've got here a finite number of patients who within a finite period of time all of those should be treated effectively, and so you could say that's a one-off. You're absolutely right. There are other unmet clinical needs that would be revolutionary. We've got the Opdivo, the new the anti-cancer for offering hope for lung cancer patients. And you've got to think that if the clinical work on that continues and the results improve, the fact that you start to offer what is close as much as you can get to a cure from a therapy, then who's to say? You're right with insulin. Anti-diabetic therapy is still, although it's moved forward a long way, it's still in its infancy almost. There's huge opportunities. And if someone could take a tablet that would correct all the insulin deficiencies and stimulate insulin production again, yeah, that would be a huge blockbuster. But I think in the short term, I don't think we're going to see anything else like the Hep C therapies at the moment for the near-term future.
What Dr. Ball said about the sort of gold standard, because it's fine, having growth in these infusion and injectable drugs, but from a patient compliance and time with the doctor or teaching them to use inhalers, it's a lot more. A lot more than just telling them to take a tablet once a day.
There is a golden opportunity for payers to save money, because you talked about compliance, but you link it to convenience of administration. Now, you can give me the best, easiest, convenient drug to take, but as a stupid patient, I will not be compliant. You said about finished dose forms. The finished dose form doesn't end with a finished dose form. Patient information, you talked about patient information. Nobody reads the patient information leaflet. So how do you communicate with the patient
I think actually that there is an issue here, which is that I think that patients are still far too receptive, that they are not empowered enough. So we have to turn it on its head, which is you have to say, I, as a physician, work with you in conjunction, but ultimately it's your responsibility. And I think there is a role to play, but I do think those patient leaflets could really. I know you have to put them in for regulatory.
Is there a role to play for the FDF event?
Absolutely. This is what I was thinking. You go beyond the finished dose.
Yes.
Yes.
What does it mean? How do you take it? What are the consequences if you don't take it? What if you take it with something else? The only way around compliance issues is to have an implant, really. That's the only way to say you're going to be fully compliant.
Yeah. I would also say that and I guess along those lines, but you're seeing a lot of innovation in the packaging world that where they're integrating technology into packages and to basically both monitor the dose that the patient is taking, but also to remind the patient to take the dose.
Yes.
And that's really that's something that's I think will be revolutionary over the next 5 to 10 years.
There are some nice apps actually on smartphones that do actually remind you, and you can you can actually look up the drugs, and it puts a little picture of the drug and tells you what you should be taking and everything. Yeah. I've only just learned this, as you can tell. I'm very excited, over excited. Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, quick question. Do you not think it is the responsibility of formulation developers and people who are coming up with technologies like sustained relays and things which could improve patient engagement? Is it not their responsibility to work with the pharmaceutical companies who are marketing the product to educate patients in how these dosage, or taking it at the right time, as we're talking about compliance and concordance, but we are leaving the entire headache to pharmaceutical companies to educate patients and physicians on the second instance. So why are formulation developing CDMOs or CMOs not educating patients? Why are they not engaging with pharmaceuticals to educate patients in compliance?
I think it depends on which country you're in. Here in the UK, I think probably I'd do a broad brush that GPs don't have enough time to actually spend with the patient to tell them everything they should tell them. The second thing is the industry would love that direct-to-patient communication. You get it certainly with some diabetic therapies, you get it certainly with some asthma therapies, and the patients benefit from that dialogue. There are many indications and therapeutic areas where you don't have that dialogue, which I think is your point. You could improve the dialogue if the pharmaceutical company had access to those patients. Of course, patient confidentiality is in place, so the ability to communicate and have a dialogue with your patient is in certain areas difficult. And again, we know if you do the internet searches, who's looking at what sites, you see there is a percentage of patients who do actually use that facility. And then when you look at the age groups, it's obviously at the younger end of the spectrum. So if we could lift that into the another decade or
that
so.
probably could be maybe a stream you should look into in your conference in terms of how to generate more communication from CDMOs and CMOs to engage with the patients and work hand in hand with pharma.
Yeah, I would say just as a general point, the CMO's customer is the pharma company, and often the pharma company doesn't even want anybody to know that a CMO is making the product as opposed to themselves. And in the regulatory world, certainly in the U.S. and the FDA world, it's the pharma company that's responsible. So even if there's if the drug, something goes wrong in the manufacturing process and then there's a problem with the drug, it's the pharma company's responsibility to oversee the manufacturer. So there's really, the CMOs are separated, but so it's really the pharma company's responsibility. I would also say that, just quickly, that certainly we've seen increasingly in the U.S. where the providers, the practitioner organizations, and the payers, the insurance companies, because it's a different system, have figured out that if we can make sure people take their medications, we can keep them out of the hospital. And so they've started to employ social workers who follow up on patients to make sure the patients are taking their medications, because that's a lot cheaper than going to a practitioner, and it's also a lot cheaper than letting them go to the hospital because they miss their doses.
Also, if I could say, some pharmaceutical companies have actually taken that step to reach out to the end user effectively through their bid to be seen as content and thought leaders in the market. We are seeing more and more pharmaceutical companies actually having separate websites to their company websites, very much talking about preventative cure or various conditions that certain age groups are facing, and they're doing that, as you mentioned also, Alan, through social media as well. So I think we've maybe seen a start of this trend.
Yeah, absolutely.
How much it gets picked up and is ignited by the rest of the market, it'll be interesting to see over the coming years.
And that exactly links to what we're trying to achieve, because CPhI as a brand is predominantly seen as a platform for doing business in pharma, but I think the FDF side is, as Paul was also saying, it is the whole, everything put together. So I think that's where FDF can potentially play a bigger role to industry in the communication element, and what Cara is touching on with some of the companies already trying to reach out to patients directly. There is absolutely a platform for that. So if we can achieve that over the years, there will be also a great win.
I was just going to chip in that I think as well it'd be a great forum to discuss from industry perspective how we get a reasonable reward for these innovations. Certainly from the generics industry perspective, there's lots of things we can do from formulation FDF point of view to improve known molecules and make them better for patient compliance and so on. But the question is okay, but then if I as a generic producer or the company that's come up with this improved formulation find my drug put in the same tender group or the same reference price group as the standard generic at 50 cents a pack, I can't do it. There's no way I can invest in this technology. So I think there's a huge barrier to improved FDF usage and patient compliance through the payer thing. So I think if we can engage payers, the insurance funds and the decision makers on that and say, okay, but if you want incremental innovation, there has to be some reward for the companies doing it.
I think that's an important point, because at last year's, which was the EGA conference, now Medicines for Europe, the patient groups were there, and they said they could not understand why, as a patient, that's exactly what they want. Improved convenience, ease of administration, and it's the one thing that they're not getting support from the NHS or other payers who say we're not willing to pay for that, when they're saying you don't understand what the patient really wants. And for that extra money, we would be a lot happier and be able to take our medicines easily, be more compliant. The end result in terms of financial numbers would probably be much better. But getting that message across is so difficult.
But then also it depends on your healthcare system, doesn't it? So it's very country specific. So for example, if you're on an anti-epileptic medication, it's much cheaper to give something that you take BD twice a day as opposed to a slow release product, because it costs more money. And at the end of the day, and particularly here in the UK, we have a spiraling problem. We just don't have enough money, and there has to be some form of rationing at some point, doesn't there?
But what happens if you have a breakthrough fit? What's the cost of that?
Well, I mean, you're right. You're absolutely right.
Because
the cost
I
then
forgot to take my second dose.
Well, I totally agree with you, but also you have to then look at the cost economics, because how many will then end up? Yes, you may have a seizure, but how many of those seizures end up in A&E? And I agree. I think, and as a former A&E doctor, I know all too well.
But then put yourself in the patient's shoes. It's not that you haven't ended up in A&E, but the fact you've had a seizure to the people around you, your family, that's very disconcerting and worrying. The ability to have a once-a-day formulation. Okay,
totally.
If you forget your once-a-day formulation as well, you're in trouble anyway. So the compliance and convenience aspect, you have to, as I said earlier, you have to try and weigh the two together.
So do you think that perhaps we're at the beginning of a much longer journey, which is and in Europe, where actually the pharmaceutical industry has always had to behave within certain parameters? Do you think it's changing in that clearly you want to be able to talk directly to consumers? We, as clinicians, want consumers to be more informed. Surely isn't that the extrapolation of that argument actually, possibly, we should go down more of the American route? I'm not saying with those ridiculous things at the end of the adverts where they talk really quickly and no one can understand what they say, but you know what I mean. But possibly isn't the extrapolation of that argument that actually we need to work together to ensure that patients get the maximum amount of relevant information?
I think
because some of the work we're doing is not just about products, but it's about working with the health system here in the UK, with NHS England and the devolved countries, looking at something they're calling medicines optimization, which is we spend a lot on medicines. It's 10+% of the healthcare budgets, but do we really get the best out of them? And a lot of that investment in medicines is wasted for some of the reasons we've heard being described this morning. Either the patients don't know how to use them properly, they don't read the leaflets, they don't understand there is a balance between the benefits and the potential risk of side effects. And there probably does need to be a different way of running the conversation, so there is more connection between what pharmaceutical companies are doing, the information that's being given to patients through their healthcare professionals, through their pharmacists and their doctors, but also what increasingly they find out for themselves independently. So I think we all know about patients pitching up at their doctors with the printouts that they've got for themselves. So they are getting a lot more informed, and perhaps some of the practices that we work that constrain at the moment are perhaps a little bit outdated, because regulation by its nature always tends to lag behind. But I think we will see a lot going on in that field, bringing things much more closer together, which does again fit with the FDF concept, and patients becoming much more to the centre of the conversation about making decisions for their own healthcare and using newer technologies and apps and electronic enhancements to the medicines themselves as reminders. So I think we've got a long way to go on that, but I think the trend is clear, and I can see it only going in one way.
Any other questions from the floor at all? Perhaps, yes. Hang on, let me skip over to you.
Thank you. I wonder if Jim would like to comment on what's going to be the effect of the generic drug user fee amendments on companies in the US, and what are the CMO's view on this?
So this is GDUFA.
Right, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, you know, GDUFA, of course, we're living under GDUFA 1 now, and one of the elements of that has been to charge a fee to any facility that's manufacturing a generic to pay for the inspection, and that's been that's been an issue for the CMO industry, because it wasn't anticipated in a lot of their contracts, and so kind of who pays for that, whether the CMO pays for it or the customer pays for that, has been an issue. But that's all of that is up for negotiation at the moment, and because the renewal of GDUFA is being negotiated, and the bill is being developed right now. But certainly the concept has been to by charging, well, prior to GDUFA, I think as probably most people know, if you filed for a new drug application, a branded drug application, you would pay a fee to have the file reviewed and the facility inspected. But until GDUFA, that wasn't the case for generics. And so there ended up being an enormous backlog of generic approval applications because there weren't the resources to review them and do the inspections. The idea of GDUFA was to provide the resources to do that. It's had some benefit in that way. But not nearly as much, I would say, as the industry and the FDA had hoped. Figuring out that it's a bit of it's a major negotiation between the generic industry and the FDA and the CMO industry on what the fees should be and how more resources can be put into place to further reduce that backlog. I think the impact, certainly I think the impact has been, say, to reduce the number of applications. Often when the application was free, companies would put in an application without necessarily an intention of marketing the drug, but just to have it there just in case. But now it's certainly, companies generally file the application and pay the fee because they intend to have a commercial product on the market. That's helped the backlog, and I think it also helps drug prices. I think I'm not sure what the ultimate implications of the next round of GDUFA are going to be because, frankly, we don't know any of the details yet.
So we'll wait and see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like everything else, we'll wait and see.
Isn't that the truth?